Welcome. We're talking about mind talk and how our behavior is controlled largely by the thoughts and patterns that go on in our head. And we've been identifying mind talk as separate from thoughts, or not separate, but a particular kind of thought, which is a repetitive statement or judgment or we listed some of the issues there: criticism or accusation or wish or despair, etc. There are lots, and there's still more that we could write up. So there's a constant dialogue going on in our head, and all our actions are triggered by thoughts. A thought triggers an intention, the appropriate emotion gets evoked, and the action happens. The emotion actually is what gets our body going. Our thought doesn't get our body going. You think, something, and if the body doesn't receive the message, it's just going to sit there saying, so what? But you think, jump, and your body says, oh, jump, and all your muscles work in unison, and you jump, or you walk, or you eat, or you do whatever you do. So our thinking has a profound influence on how we behave. We tend to think that this is who I am. We've lived all our lives like this, and so we've come to a point where the way we are is the way we think who it is that we are. That's me. But when we realize that a lot of our thinking has actually been taught to us, that we've learned it, we've mimicked others, we've copied others, we've reacted to others, we've seen how they've managed, and so we've picked up patterns. And we've added our own particular flavor. So we've picked up patterns of thinking which have then become dormant or resident in our minds. And the problem with the thinking and the thinking setting off actions is that the thinking that is conscious we can manage to a point. We'll talk about that in a moment. But a lot of the thinking has become unconscious. And so a lot of our behavior is triggered by thoughts that we aren't even aware that we're having. Okay, so I want to start a little bit and look at our thinking. How aware are we of our thoughts? What is our relationship with our own thoughts, the content of our mind? Because we tend to think that I am my thoughts. And we need to separate ourselves from that and say, I have thoughts. And I choose thoughts. And I do with my thoughts what I want to do with my thoughts. It's a bit like our clothes. When we go home tonight, we take our clothes off, put our pajamas on, and tomorrow we'll pick up our clothes, these are the other ones, and put them on. We need to separate ourselves from our thoughts and realize we have thoughts. Because too much we become identified with our thoughts, and we think that the thoughts we have are who we are. And so we become enslaved by our own thoughts, or we become entrapped in our own thinking process. Looking at our thoughts, the thoughts we have most often, today we thought thousands of thoughts. Of all those thoughts, have you had any new thoughts? Is there been any thought today that is totally fresh that you think, oh wow, I've never still thought that before? Most of our thoughts are repetitive and familiar. It's like we know what we do, what we think, how we think, and so we employ. It's a bit like having a toolbox with a whole lot of tools. We know what's in the toolbox, and we use our tools over and over again. Now, on one level, that's okay because we know ourselves and we know how to work, how to live. The problem with repetitive thoughts are we tend to think that that's the only thoughts we have. Okay. So what if there's something new that's needing to happen? What if you meet a new person? Do you allow them to change your thinking, or do you put your thinking onto them and fit them into the way you're already thinking? In other words, how flexible are your thoughts? Because if they're quite rigid, you'll say, that's not how I see it. I see it like this. It's got to fit into my pattern. And so in everything, you will actually conform that to your thinking process. And that's a problem, because then if there's something new or unexpected, how is it going to get in? You might say, no, I don't do that. I don't think like that, or I can't accept that, or I'll argue against it and find a weakness and discount it. Lots of arguments are trying to find one issue you disagree with, and then you discount the whole exercise just because you think that your argument is watertight, or that's how you think. What do you think? So I just thought about 4 different aspects of thinking. One is new thoughts, new fresh thoughts. And I'm going to give you an example, and notice what you'll think as I do this. Io mi metto a parlare in italiano e voi dovete capire quello che dico, e se non capite quello che dico, posso dire che non avete imparato niente.
Esattimo.
Okay. Now, notice what you thought at that moment. You were confused, you were amused, you were puzzled, you were wondering. I maybe said you're an idiot. Or I might have said you're my best friend. I actually said if I spoke in Italian, you probably wouldn't understand much and you wouldn't learn much. What I'm trying to say is, how open are we to fresh, new thoughts, to a different thought? Will we hear it and push it back out, or will we hear it and embrace it and incorporate it into our thinking? So you get new thoughts, you get repetitive thoughts, the ones we're very familiar with. The biggest group that we use daily, like I said, today we've had many, many thoughts. And then a third group I thought is old thoughts, thoughts that we used to think that we haven't thought for a while. Elizabeth found something I'd written some years ago, and I was reading it and I thought, I don't think like this anymore. The words I used are different. I've changed, I've shifted, I've moved on. And so it felt quite archaic, or quite, it was interesting, but I could actually feel the difference. So old thoughts, there might be thoughts that you had in childhood. There might be thoughts that were very familiar in your family, and now that you've moved away from your family, they're no longer part of you. But they're there because they are connected to certain experiences, and I'll talk about that in a moment. And then the fourth area are unconscious thoughts. Thoughts that we think, but that have sunk into unconsciousness. And dreams, I think, are often an expression of that. It's information, it's pictures, it's feelings coming out of somewhere. And it's not our conscious usually. I mean, we look at our dreams, we might recognize a few images, but many we don't. Now, if you were to step outside of yourself and watch your brain working, watch how you manage the different thought processes. I was thinking it's a bit like an algorithm. It sort of has triggers, and it comes back to certain areas, and we have cherished channels, cherished flavors of thinking, and we tend to think of those most often, and spin-offs from those. So, if you like food, what kind of food you like? And you'll find 5 or 6 or 10 different sort of items, and you keep coming back to them. And somebody from a different culture will have a totally different food chain in their mind. Okay? You might think of, anything. We tend to shape a certain mindset. They call it a mindset around certain topics. Now, that's all good, but the question is always, how open is it? How accessible is it? How rigid is it? Because the rigidity of our mind is the problem we're trying to deal with. Our mind likes familiarity, it likes repetition, because then it can work unconsciously. It can shove a lot of it into the unconscious, because then it frees up the RAM, the access memory, and it likes to work with images it knows. It doesn't like stuff it doesn't know, because then it stops and says, what is this? I mean, if we'd passed around some food that we'd never heard of, we'd all looked at it and thought, are we supposed to eat it? Should we like it? Would I like it? Do I want to? No, I don't think So your mind is trying to work out where this fits in the picture. But the parts that it knows well, it sort of knows where to put things, so it likes things organized and analyzed and categorized and sorted. And then it's done its job. Its job is to manage information. So it doesn't like surprises, not much, unless you wired that way. I mean, some of us react. We don't like normal, we don't like boring. And so, let's stand on our heads for a while and see if that'll work. So we'll do something different. But the point I'm wanting to make is, we need to understand how our thoughts work and what the patterns are, because if anything, they will ossify. Osso in Italian is a bone. So they become bony, or they become hardened, or what's the word in English? Rigid. They ossify. Yeah, ossify is a good word. And that's bad thinking, because then you're not living. When your thinking has stopped expanding, you've stopped living. And what's happened is it isn't closed on a healthy content. It's closed on a lot of stuff that's not healthy. A lot of past patterns, a lot of wounds, a lot of self-centered conclusions, lots of patterns that actually aren't helpful, which is why people often alienate themselves from others more and more and end up living alone in a flat with a cat and a TV, because they've lost the ability to be flexible, to learn, to listen, to be interested in something new, to try something new. People, we're creatures of habit, and we tend to pull back into our habits, and that's not good for our growth. And we can be breathing, but we might actually be dead in the sense of we just, we don't want anything that's not within our frame of reference. And change or healing from that context is very difficult, because often it's the surprise, it's the unexpected that actually is where we need to open up. And for those of us who have faith, God will always surprise us. He'll almost never come the way we expect. So if you expect to say, God, there's your door, you can come through here, he says, that's the one place I won't come. So we got to stay open. And sometimes I'm thinking, and I think, that's funny, that thought wasn't mine. So I'll see my train of thought, and then there'll be a phrase or a sentence that isn't mine. I wasn't thinking it. They were words I don't use. They were not in the context of what I was doing, because my mind would have had a different sequence. And then I'll write them down and say, this is from somewhere else. And I think it's from God often, because it's often something like, well, I haven't thought of that person for 20 years, phone them up, and they were thinking of committing suicide. I thought, well, where did that come from? So it's like, stuff like that does happen, but it's being aware of your thinking pattern. And so when we start looking at what manages and how we manage our engagement with the world and with ourselves, the problem with the false self, it hooks onto thought patterns, and it holds and makes them rigid, and that becomes our filter for living. Most of our self-talk comes out of the false self. So if you can identify some of the false self, you'll start picking up the false self. The true self hasn't really developed much of an credible thought pattern, because we're trying to avoid the true self. From birth, to fit in society, we've developed a false self, because that's what society wants us to have. It doesn't want us to have a true self. You're supposed to have manners, you're supposed to do this, you're supposed to do that. Sure, we'll treat you as an individual, but you must fit in. And so a lot of our development is in the fitting in, is creating a false self and managing that false self. I've got to be kind to my aunt, but I can't stand her, so I'll just smile and pretend I'm okay, but I'm not okay. That kind of game playing, we do a lot of the time, because we're in a society that expects and pushes and demands and wants. And so we play that game, but within that we sort of also do our own thing and cut corners and do a bit of this and a bit of that. And so we manage the process, but it's all around a false self. If you really wanted to be your true self, you'd probably find it quite difficult, because A, you wouldn't know what it looked like. B, society, you'd have a problem with society saying, that doesn't work here, you'd have to get out. Even your family might say, what's wrong with you? People get to know who we are, and when we try and change, they usually the one who have the bigger problem with our changing. Because, they're used to you being one way, you try to be another way, and they think you're trying to show them up, or you're trying to avoid them, or you're trying to show that you're better than them or something. Often change is more difficult because of what others think than what you're really struggling with.